So up next, we have Vana.
Hello.
And she is a Greek New Zealand poet and translator who's been moving between Aotearoa and Greece for the last 20 years. You must be a bit tired.
Yeah, I'm
Shifting all your stuff every week.
Yeah.
She's also the Ursula Bethel writer in residence at UC. So does that mean you can write people's essays for them?
It means anyone who wants to just write a poem can come to me after and I'll whip one up for you.
Fantastic. What's your rate? $50 a poem?
No, free today, free. Cool. Free for you.
And she is going to be discussing how art can be used to communicate environmental messaging, which I think is really cool because we've had so many professors yesterday, professors and PhDs and doctors, and they know lots and lots about microplastics.
Well, I'm intimidated by those people.
But we need the balance of the yin and the yang. We need the art. So over to you. Tell us how we can get art to help us change the world.
It's such a big topic, isn't it? And we have a short amount of time. So what I thought I'd do is I just position myself in terms of the kinds of experiences I've had personally and the kinds of environmental arts practices that I'm really interested in doing more of, and just give them to you as almost case studies. And if we have time, then clearly we could get a little bit of like question answer or kōrero around it. I should have introduced myself more properly. So yes, no te whanganui atara me Athene o. And that means that with Wellington and with Athens being my two poles, I've kind of, as Tim has said, been moving between the two for a really long time. And that's given me, I guess, a couple of contexts to play with. And I guess contexts for me is a key word because if anything, I think art reveals contexts, reveals current contexts, but also imagines alternate contexts, imagines alternate worlds, imagines alternate positions. And when I think of the most obvious choice, at least in literature, I think of sci-fi, right? Which has really, really influenced technology in the real world. So that to me indicates that art is, and one of its places that it very happily and positively resides is in its imagination of other worlds. Leaving aside all the very, very positive. We were talking with Eugenie just quickly about the positive antidote that art provides in terms of like finding your own personal space to stand in and for it to provide an antidote to all sorts of like anxieties, right? And low moments, because speaking for myself, there are a lot of them. For me also, in terms of like reconciling the world and yourself within it, and figuring out how you can continue to contribute and how you can continue to be a conscious kind of citizen in the world without it weighing you down so much so that you feel like you can't contribute or that you're paralyzed. And art gives you, whatever that art is, whether it's literature making, whether it's something in the graphic arts, whether it's performance art, which of course might inhabit all sorts of those places. There's lots of slam poetry you guys will know about, lots of spoken word, there are lots of merging art spaces actually at the moment, which also speaks to, I think, a really utopian vision of art, which is that art, it's an example of not necessarily having to inhabit a single space, but being comfortable in hybrid, merging, multi-spaces, a dialoguing where you and I can talk. And through that talking, through that dialoguing, comes this other artifact, this other conversation, this new world that can't have been anticipated before the dialoguing began. So art as dialogue as well, right? Which is something that you've been doing and you do all your lives, constantly, every day, this dialoguing. It's considered an arts practice also when worn under the kind of arts practice hat. And so I didn't even look at the time. I've probably already been talking for half the time, but maybe I'll just quickly move to my experience of living in Greece, where some of you will know, some of you may not necessarily, but a few years ago, Greece found itself in a very difficult economic place. It was basically insolvent. It owed a lot of money and it couldn't really pay it back. And that meant that there was a lot of economic crisis. Lots of jobs were lost. In fact, lots of, state-initiated programs to do even with the environment were put aside because there was no more funding, there was no, infrastructure really suffered, the medical system fell apart. I was living there, I'd been living there for 10 years, and we were also made redundant from our jobs. 1,000 people out of a university that my partner and I worked at immediately made redundant. And so there was a lot of crisis. And out of that crisis, what I can sort of share with you today is the kind of arts phoenix that rose from the ashes. And I don't want to downplay any of the suffering, either from the social side or from the environmental side, that happened as a result of some of the, some of the initiatives that were great that fell away at that time. I don't want to downplay any of those things. People lost their jobs. They had to, luckily Greece is, has a family unit, has a very strong central unit. So people sort of all merged and lived together in big sort of family units. A lot of our friends did this in order to cope with some of the constraints. So Athens was and is, a really bustling, crazy, chaotic city. But one of the effects of shops closing down, for example, right, was this takeover of arts space. And, they were rent-free often, they still are. Landlords or people who own these homes often, they weren't well-off people to begin with, but they just really wanted them to be used. So boards came off, art spaces moved in. There was a lot of street art. So in that way, having lived in Auckland and Tamaki Makaurau and Wellington, coming to Christchurch for this residency has been like really reminiscent to me of Athens, with so much street art that's around here also, arising similarly out of the crisis that, took place post-earthquake in Christchurch. So we had a lot of arts practice going on, but it wasn't insular. It wasn't a case of, I want to make some art and come and see my picture on the wall. In fact, it had a very civic-minded approach. And I'm thinking of two examples in particular where there were parts of the city that had lost power, and some of the arts projects, or one particular arts project that took place in a very sort of deprived part of the city, was to do street lighting, Now, I can't speak to the particulars of the electricity science, arts person speaking, that took place. But what the outcome was that there were, a lot of the art spaces that had taken up residence in that part of town joined forces, and there was a lot of unemployment. So there were a lot of really savvy people who hadn't been artists in their lives, but who had, perhaps had, positions of varying. They could have been scientists or sociologists or archaeologists. So there were a lot of young people with really supreme knowledge and very educated, interesting, alert and awake people who came together and installed grids along, sort of from building to building, grids along the tops of some of these sidewalks and pedestrianized places and streets, and hung all manner of just glorious, beautiful light fittings that they'd found discarded in landfill. So, there was a lot of new and interesting work going on. There were community gardens being put up, but, in sort of dead space where there might have been some demolished buildings, and people came out, there was time, people had time on their hands. They started up community gardens projects, but not only with the view of having edible food production and using the land that was otherwise sitting inert and dead, but to beautify. There was a collective depression going on in Greece It was very, very hard. So they wanted to beautify these spaces as well. And that artistic kind of aesthetic articulation was very much part of that time. I'd also been living in Crete, and I just want to briefly mention the Crete example. A friend of mine Australian artist, Matthew Halperin, who, and I'm really sorry also that I don't have audio-visual to show you, because this was a very quick me coming to here and to talk to you today. But really, as I talk to you, I almost want to put something together just to have available to you at a later time that you can flick through. And I will try to do that, I think. But jumping back to Crete, Iraklio was the main town in Crete. Similar, the country was the same kind of, everywhere. Downtrodden part of town, not in a good way, lots of social and environmental issues. And he basically took possession with the permission of the landlord. He said, look, I'm going to move into your space and I'm going to do it up. I'm going to paint it. I want to have an artist residency. And so I want to have people from all over. Now it started off with friends of his from other parts of Europe. This residency has become quite huge now. And I will put together this document, but if you're taking notes and you're interested, it's the Lakos Residence, Lakkos, as an example of what can happen when you build something up from nothing. And in his case, he had lots of artists coming, and what they did was they spoke to the city council of Iraklio, and they said, look, we're going to have all these artists coming to this downtrodden part of town, but we want to give something back to the community, and we want to give something back to the environment of the city. So what can we do? They had this big, hui backwards and forwards. And so every artist who comes to reside and work on their own project must give back somehow. And usually that's in the way of street art, but it's been in the way of other environmental projects as well. So there's a really beautiful marriage there between thinking about alternate realities, like inhabiting your own artistic space, whatever that may be, and also thinking about your space within a wider framework and within, a wider network of other spaces. That's that whole idea of like, that horizontal relationshiping, like we relationship to each other in a horizontal way rather than in a linear top-down kind of way, which I saw really strongly when I was living there. And I don't actually know now how much time I have left, but I'll just very quickly say, coming back to Aotearoa, I've been really interested myself in using walking practice, much like what you guys were doing this morning. In fact, identical, it's just given it a different name, right? And using it in terms of bringing people together and inhabiting materially and bodily a space, a natural space, and using that space to write, to kōrero, to walk and dialogue, to open up the space really to possibility. And part of my project here at the Ursula Bethel residency has been to think about those issues, and it is culminating in a session at the Word Festival too, which it will be a walk. This isn't a plug, but I'm just telling you what I'm doing. It's a walk that we'll share Kai at the end, we'll put together a collaborative poem, and it will be published. So multiple voices, multiple possibilities, and hopefully with a view towards relationship building and environment, nurturing and self-nurturing as well. So I think that might be, is that 20 minutes? Yeah. That's me. I hope that's been a little bit of an injection about all things possible in artivism. Thank you.
Couple of quick questions.
Yeah.
Any questions? Couple of quick questions. No? Yes? Just throw it. No. It's your mic. You choose.
Where is it?
Teamwork. Let's go. Let's pass the baton. Stop the clock. Go.
If when
we're not particularly artistic ourselves, or we're not that good at art, do you have any advice for how we can maybe express ourselves?
I love that question.
Great question.
I love that question, and I almost should have said that my definition of art making is really just being, is really just existing. If you're existing in this room and you have an imagination and your thoughts wander at any time in your lives, or you find yourself ever wondering what things can be differently, then to my mind, that's art making. You know, it doesn't, to my mind, art making is not, I've been to some fine art school, or I've done some kind of creative writing course, and I've written a book and blah, blah, blah. It's not those things. You might devote yourself to something more specific at some point, but if you're in this space right now, imagining other worlds, you are making art. That's what I think.
Awesome.